21st, 2014, Darsh Patel, who was a 22-year-old college student, was out hiking in a New Jersey state park along with 5 of his college buddies. As they were about to head down a particular trail that they had actually gone to this park to go down, a man and woman come charging up the path towards them. And so Darsh and his friends stop and they're looking at these 2 people who look totally distraught and scared. And the man and woman immediately say, "Hey, don't go down this path. We were just down there, and for the past 10 minutes, a black bear has been stalking us in the tree line. We don't know where it went, but we got up here, we turned around and it was gone, but we would not suggest going down this path. It's just not worth it." Darsh and his friends tell the couple, "Thank you for giving us the heads up. We were actually going to go down that path, and so I guess now we won't." And so the couple, they quickly leave, and Darsh and his friends are sitting there thinking, well, now what do we do? Because this was the trail we were going to go down. This is why we're here. As they're standing there, they start talking about, well, maybe we just go down anyways. There's 6 of us. I highly doubt that a bear is going to come out of the woods and attack 6 people, especially a black bear that is not known to attack people. Why don't we just walk down a ways, and if we see the bear, then we just turn around and leave. And if we see the bear, might make some good pictures. Let's just go down there and see what happens." And they start walking. And sure enough, about 10 minutes into their trip down this trail, they see this massive bear parked right in the center of the trail, about 250 meters away from where they were. The bear did not appear to be doing anything. It was just sitting there, but it was clearly looking at the group of them. So Darsh and his friends are just standing there, not really sure what to do, so they start taking pictures and videos. They're not moving any closer, but they just start documenting what they're seeing because this bear was apparently stalking this couple. It was pretty interesting, and they figured, hey, make some good pictures. So they start taking pictures and taking some videos of this animal, and the animal starts walking towards them. Now, it's 250 meters away. They recognize that this is a dangerous animal, and we don't want to get too close to it, but they felt relatively safe. Even if it started moving towards them initially, they still felt safe. But the animal starts jogging towards them. At this point, the boys put their phones away, turn around, and they start hightailing it the other way. And somebody looks back and notices the bear is now sprinting at them. This causes the group to completely panic. They start sprinting back towards where their cars were parked. Absolute full panic back up the trail. No one's paying attention to anybody else. They're just running for their lives. And as they're turning their heads to look, the bear is gaining on them and gaining on them. Finally, after about 10 minutes of just running for their lives, they make it to the parking lot and they turn around. There's no bear, but there's short one hiker. Darsh Patel is still in the forest somewhere. The group starts screaming for Darsh. They know there was this aggressive bear in there chasing them, so they're obviously worried about him potentially getting attacked, and so they immediately call 911. The police show up and park rangers show up, and they go into the forest to try to find this bear and to find Darsh. And very quickly they come across this bear in a clearing, this 300-pound bear all by itself, aggressively pacing around this lump in the middle of this clearing that had sticks and branches on it. It wasn't clear what it was, and this bear is just pacing in a circle around this thing. And as these 2 park rangers get closer, they're armed. The bear looks at them and makes a move like it's going to charge, and they elect to shoot and kill this bear. Later, the bear's remains would be taken to a laboratory, and inside of the bear's stomach was Darsh Patel. He had been killed and eaten by this bear, and that lump that was on the ground that the bear was circling was whatever was left of Darsh that had not been consumed yet. When they recovered Darsh Patel's phone, they went into his images and they found he had taken one final picture before he was attacked. Here it is. The bear was not malnourished, it was not diseased, it just decided it wanted to stalk, kill, and eat a human. In 1975, a criminal who had been dubbed the Visayala Ransacker had been terrorizing the Eastern District of Sacramento, California. Initially, he would break into people's homes when they were sleeping by prying open one of their windows. He would go inside and basically ransack their house. He wouldn't steal any of the major valuables that were right in plain sight. He would just kind of throw things all over the place and would take 1 or 2 small things, probably as a souvenir. Unfortunately, by the summer of 1976, this Visayala ransacker was not only not caught, but was also no longer satisfied with just breaking into people's homes and ransacking them and taking a few things. He had moved on to killing people, and so he had been given a new nickname, one that just about everybody knew at the time, and that was the Golden State Killer. Once he began killing people, he became much more cautious about how he would actually go about attacking them. He would oftentimes break into his victims' homes while they weren't there, and he would walk their property, look for guns and unload them. He would look for any security cameras or devices and turn them off. He would plant ligatures, pieces of rope and twine that he could use to bind people's arms and legs. He would place them in their house, and then he would leave. and he would study his victims and get to know their patterns and know when they were going to be in the house, when they were going to be in certain rooms. And then at some point he would sneak in through a window at night while they were sleeping, and their victims would wake up with him standing over them with a flashlight in their face. On the rare occasion where neighbors or police had actually spotted this guy, they saw that he was wearing a full face mask and he was very athletic. He was able to elude police capture and would jump over fences and would run away. By the end of 1976, when the Golden State Killer had still not been caught, citizens of Sacramento became furious with the police. They felt like they were not doing enough to try to catch this guy. So on November 3rd, 1976, the police actually host this huge town hall meeting, and they invite all the citizens of Sacramento to come be a part of it, voice your complaints, listen to what police are actually trying to do to catch the Golden State Killer, and basically just have an opportunity to air your grievances a little bit. During the meeting, a man in the crowd who was a citizen of Sacramento stands up and basically starts making fun of the Golden State Killer, calling him weak and a coward, saying, you're preying on women. If you ever came to my house, I would totally beat the crap out of you. Like, this guy's a joke. And everybody in the town hall meeting just totally ate it up. It was like this one little victory for the town of Sacramento is we're going to put down the Golden State Killer for being weak and a coward. Then, in an ironic twist of fate, that guy who was making fun of the Golden State Killer, he and his wife became the next victims of the Golden State Killer. And in fact, the Golden State Killer changed his entire MO. Instead of kind of targeting random people all over Sacramento, he began only targeting married couples, and he would always attack when the husband was home. For decades, the Golden State Killer eluded capture and even taunted the police in threatening phone calls all the way up until 2001. But in 2016, they reinvestigated the Golden State Killer case using DNA evidence, something that was not available in the 70s and the 80s when they were investigating these crimes. And it was through this reinvestigation that they were able to capture 74-year-old Joseph DeAngelo in 2018, who was, in fact, the Golden State Killer. DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was given 12 consecutive life sentences. When the killer was finally identified as Joseph DeAngelo, police were going through some of the older case photos and they made a startling discovery. This is a picture from the November 3rd, 1976 town hall meeting, and there in the middle of the photo is none other than Joseph DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer. And he was there when that citizen of Sacramento stood up and began berating the Golden State Killer, saying how he was a coward and weak and that he would totally beat him up if he ever came to his house. And there's Joseph DeAngelo sitting there listening to this guy. And after the meeting, what does he do? He targets the guy that spoke out against him. And even after he attacked this guy, apparently he was so upset that he changed his entire MO and only targeted married couples from that point on, as if he was proving a point that you can't touch me. The Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was starting to show signs of significant activity. The tremors had become so powerful that the citizens of a nearby town called Amero, that was home to 31,000 people, they started to become very concerned. If this thing were to go off, we're only 30 miles away, we'd be leveled. And unfortunately, just a couple of months later, on November 13th, 1985, the volcano would erupt, and it would create a massive mudslide that would just devastate Amero. The mudflow covered 85% of this town in heavy, thick sludge. It destroyed buildings and bridges, and it killed 25,000 people. Remember, there's only 31,000 people in this village to begin with, so 80% of the population has been killed by this mudslide. Because of how big of a disaster this was, it took a while for the rescue efforts to mobilize, and so anybody that was on the fringe of being saved unfortunately perished because no one was there to rescue them in time. And then when rescue crews did get out and did start helping people, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough people to help. And so hundreds of people that could have been saved were just trapped and no one could get to them in time. Photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Colombia 2 days after this eruption with the intent to photograph the ground rescue that was going on inside of Amero. When he actually arrived in Amero, he was really shocked to see just how completely destroyed this town was and how totally ineffective the rescue efforts were. It was just totally chaotic. It wasn't really clear who was helping who. There were people literally dying all over the place. It just seemed crazy that this was not being handled better. Amid this chaos, a farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come over and try to help this girl who was trapped under a house. So he brings Frank over to this house that's been completely submerged in water and mud, and clinging to a branch is this 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez that's been trapped trapped up to her neck in water. She's pinned by something in the water. They didn't know what it was, but she's been there for 60 hours. When Frank arrived, he spoke to the other rescuers that were there trying to get her out. And they said that she's been in great spirits and she's been joking about how she doesn't want to be late for school. She's just been a really positive force and we really want to get her out. But, it keeps raining, so the water keeps rising and she's already up to her neck and she's just trapped. We can't get her out. Shortly after Frank arrives, O'Mara went from chipper and lively and kind of making light of everything to most likely realizing that she wasn't going to get out of the water. And so she began telling the rescue workers to let her be, to let her rest. And she propped herself over this branch and she just laid there, kind of allowing herself to pass away. Frank felt totally helpless. I mean, he's looking at this poor girl that's going to die unless they can get her out of the water, but no one seems to be able to do it. And it just seemed totally impossible that we can't just find a way to get her out. But it would turn out that her foot was pinned under a brick door and her aunt, who had passed away and was trapped under the rubble, had grabbed her ankle and had died that way. So it was like a death grip on her ankle. And so not knowing what to do, Frank just did what he knew how to do, which was take pictures. And he knelt down and he took this picture of O'Mara. And very shortly after this picture was taken, she would pass away. This picture would win the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. When it was published, it was so disturbing that this poor girl was not able to be rescued that it created an international backlash on Colombia's nearly non-existent rescue efforts. A man living in India named Maksud Khan had become completely and totally obsessed with tigers. His wife and his family weren't entirely sure what caused him to be so fixated on tigers, but they noticed after a kind of random trip to the zoo that he took that he came home and all he could talk about were tigers. So they figured he must have seen tigers at the zoo and just become totally enamored with them. But Maksud's obsession with tigers was not just, love and affection for these animals, although certainly there was that. It was more of a dark fascination with tigers' savage nature. The story Maksud used to tell all the time to his friends and family was about this tiger that was in captivity, and one day its two trainers had gone into the cage to put a garland of flowers around its neck for maybe some ceremony or something, and the tiger just wasn't having it that day, and when they went to put it on its neck, the tiger kind of snapped and killed the two trainers. Now, Maksud was not telling the story to kind of glorify the violence of it, or even to act like it wasn't a big deal that these trainers had been killed. He was telling the story with a reverence for these creatures that were kind of untamable, that even in captivity, they were in control, and he was just totally fascinated by them. In May of that year, Maksud lost his job, something that unfortunately happened all the time for him because he was known to be kind of lazy and kind of happy-go-lucky, didn't take things very seriously. He had actually been fired from a job one time when he was supposed to be unloading sacks from a truck and got distracted by some small animal and ran after it, and his employer fired him for it. But his family depended on him and they said, Maksud, you got to go out and get another job. And so during the day, Maksud would go out and tell his family, I'm going out job hunting. But what he was really doing is spending the little money his family had to go to the zoo to go look at these tigers that he was so in love with. So for the next 4 months, Maksud would just lie to his family and would go to the zoo and stare at the tigers in their exhibit. And so one day when he was doing just that, on September 23rd, 2014, he was looking into the white tiger exhibit. Now, the way it was set up is there was an outer fence that all of the people who were at the zoo could stand right against. And it was an open air exhibit. Right on the other side of that fence, all the way around, was a little bit of land that protruded into the exhibit a little ways. And then it would drop straight down into a moat that was another layer of protection between the tigers and people, so they were not interacting. If you continued straight past the moat, it would go back up again to this little island right in the middle of this exhibit where all the tigers would spend all their time. For some reason that we don't fully understand, although one could guess that it was simply because Maksud wanted a better look at the tigers, he climbed over that first fence, the one that no visitors are allowed to cross. And he walked to the edge of that piece of land that sits over that moat. And he's looking down at the tigers, and the guards are telling him to get back on the other side of the fence. All of the other people that are there watching the tigers as well, the other visitors, they're saying, hey, come back, don't do what you're doing. And at some point, Maqsood fell 15 feet into the tiger enclosure. Immediately, an alarm goes off, waking up the tigers in their habitat. So they don't know what's going on. They're kind of looking around. And the people that are watching this happen from the safety of behind this fence, they're screaming and yelling, and they're trying to get security to come over, and they're trying to save this guy. It's just chaos. But what's really happening is they're totally inciting the tigers to see what the heck's going on. And very quickly, one of the tigers notices that there is now a person, Maqsood, who's in the moat. And the tiger jumps down into the moat and walks right over to Maqsood. And Maqsood is sitting there and he's absolutely terrified. And people said that he was just praying and he's huddled up against the side of the moat. And the tiger's just looking at him. The tiger's not showing signs that it's going to harm Maqsood. But the people that were watching this happen that are on the other side of this fence are either taking videos and pictures of the event, or some of them begin picking up rocks and throwing them at the tiger to try to, I guess, get the tiger to leave Maqsood alone. 10 minutes goes by of people throwing rocks at this tiger, and the tiger gets really upset. And so what do you think happens once the tiger gets upset? It attacks Maqsood. The tiger clamped down on Maqsood's neck and dragged him over to a grassy kind of hidden section within the enclosure. And by the time the staff finally showed up with a tranquilizer gun, it was too late for Maqsood. He was already dead. Here is the final picture of Maqsood after he's fallen inside of that moat. This is taken moments before this tiger would ultimately attack and kill him. The police would ultimately charge the zoo staff with death by negligence for their incredibly long response time and for not having any alternative rescue methods in place. The Union began investing heavily into nuclear power, and by 1977, the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station located in Chernobyl, Ukraine was finally operational. The station itself was comprised of 4 reactors that were each labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. On April 25th, 1986, a group of very sleep-deprived plant workers began running a series of routine tests on nuclear reactor number 4. They were trying to see if the reactor could still be cooled even in the event of a complete power loss. But during the test, perhaps because they were sleep-deprived and just didn't feel like doing it, they started cutting corners and violated a number of safety protocols that led to several surges of power inside of the reactor. This led to a chain reaction of explosions within reactor number 4 that culminated in a massive explosion that blew the lid off the building, exposing the reactor's core. It would take the Soviets 10 days to finally stop the fire that was raging inside of this exposed core, which meant for those 10 days, radiation on an unprecedented level was spewed into the environment by this fire. But even after the fire was controlled, you have all this radioactive material that needs to be properly disposed of. And so the Soviets started by using robots to go up and pick up these materials and dispose of them, but the robots were breaking down from the high levels of radiation. And so naturally the Soviets sent in groups of men to go pick up the material, and dozens of people died from radiation sickness. A few months after the explosion, the first steel sarcophagus was built around reactor number 4 to try to contain some of that radiation. But even with that protection, it's estimated that the area around Chernobyl will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. So as a result, the Soviet Union created what they call an exclusion zone, which is 19 miles all around Chernobyl that no one can go inside of. And so nature's kind of reclaimed this area that used to be a fairly bustling metropolis. 1 year after the disaster, Ukrainian containment crews finally broke into the steam corridor that was located underneath the molten remains of reactor number 4. And as soon as they stepped in, their radiation readers spiked all the way to the top. And so they know that whatever's at the other end of this L-shaped hallway is something they did not want to get close to. And so they put a camera on a chair with wheels and they pushed it down the hall to where it finally broke that corner and had a clear line of sight to the other end. And using a timer on the camera, they were able to take a picture of one of the single most dangerous things in the entire world. It became known as the elephant's foot. It was a molten pile of nuclear fuel and melted metal and sand and concrete that had all kind of converged and seeped through a pipe meant for steam and found its way into the basement. It was and still is emitting the equivalent level of radiation of 4.5 million chest x-rays every hour. Today, if you were to stand in front of the elephant's foot without proper equipment for 30 seconds, your cells would start to hemorrhage and you would become viciously ill, and you could even die. At 2 minutes of exposure, you're definitely going to die. But not right away. You have 48 hours and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You are 100% going. 1903, the Wright brothers successfully flew the world's first motor-operated airplane. By 1910, airplanes had improved to the point where they were considered a reasonable form of travel, and so people began focusing on how to make them safer. One big safety concern with airplanes at the time was there was no parachute small enough or light enough to be taken on board with passengers. And so if the plane malfunctioned and was crashing, everybody had to go down with it. So in 1911, a prominent French aviation club offered a large sum of money to anybody who could design a parachute for airplane passengers. A man named Franz Reichelt, who was a tailor in Paris, but who had always had a fascination with aviation, saw this reward in the paper and decided to take on this challenge. The design he came up with was not an external device like a backpack. Instead, it was a full suit with foldable bat wings that attached to the passenger's arms and connected all the way down to their ankles. Using his sewing know-how, he stitched up this totally bizarre-looking prototype, and he attached it to a dummy and threw it off of his apartment building. And amazingly, the dummy landed lightly on the ground. But when Franz, who significantly outweighed this dummy, put on his parachute suit and leapt off of the building himself, he did not touch the ground lightly. He smashed into the ground and broke his leg. But Franz was undeterred. He made dozens of changes to his suit, he added material, he subtracted material, and after a while, he felt like it was ready to be submitted to this French aviation club. But when the club members watched one of Franz's dummies wearing the suit come crashing into the ground because the canopy collapsed, they rejected his design. Franz assured them his design could work, they just needed to see it in action from a slightly higher altitude. The canopy needed more time to fully inflate. But the club members were not buying it, and they told Franz he should just give up on the design. Franz was offended and decided he would prove them wrong. So in 1911, Franz began petitioning to the city of Paris to allow him to test his design off of the Eiffel Tower. He thought if he jumped from one of their platforms, that would be high enough for his canopy to fully inflate, thereby showing that his design really did work. And so for a year, the city of Paris repeatedly rejected Franz every time he asked for the chance to do this. But in 1912, something changed and the city said, okay, you know what, Franz? You can test your parachute on the Eiffel Tower. But what the city didn't know, because Franz had intentionally kept it secret from them, was he didn't intend to launch a dummy off of the Eiffel Tower wearing his suit. He was going to put the parachute suit on and jump off these 17 stories himself. And so on February 4th of that year, Franz arrived at the tower, and standing around the base of it was a throng of people and journalists who had all read about this experiment in the newspaper. And so when Franz got out and promptly put on his parachute suit, the crowd gasped. They couldn't believe he was going to be the one jumping off of the tower. And none of Franz's friends or family knew he was going to be jumping off the tower himself. And so they pleaded with him not to do this. Throw a dummy off. You should not be jumping off. This is not going to work. Legend has it, Franz turned to one of his friends and he said, "You will see that my 72 kilos and my parachute will give your arguments the most decisive of denials." Then Franz promptly turned around and began walking up the stairs towards the platform. And with him was a journalist who brought a camera. Once Franz reached the platform, the journalist began filming him. And his video would capture Franz climbing up onto the railing and then hesitating. And he anxiously begins kind of rocking back and forth like he's debating whether he's really going to do this. And then at some point, he works up the courage and he jumps. And immediately his suit collapses and he slams into the ground, dying instantly. Another cameraman was on the ground and he filmed Franz's final jump. Here is a still shot of Franz right before impact. On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. They lived together, they shared everything. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. Janet thought her and Richard would be together forever. I mean, clearly, if you're writing him into your will. And she assumed that that feeling was reciprocated.
that Richard also felt like they were together forever. But lately, their relationship had gotten pretty rocky, and in fact, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Now, nothing was set in stone, and by no means were they destined for a breakup, but it was suddenly, a possibility, and that was really hard for Janet to deal with. And so, as Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but, getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, part of the reason that was so distracting is, Richard was all she could think about. What would happen if they broke up? What would her life look like? And so before long, her mind was kind of wandering, and no longer was it the bank statements. It was, what does the future hold for me? It seems so uncertain. And so as Janet is having this moment upstairs, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something. And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain, less loudly this time, but definitely in real pain. And she turned, and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing like something was really hurting him. And so Janet, she walked over to him and she's like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy? And like, tell me, what's happening here? And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? Why are you having somebody come here to administer it? That's unusual. But, as she was thinking about this, she could clearly see that what was really important right now was that Richard was in agonizing pain. I mean, he was holding his arm and kind of rocking back and forth, moaning. Clearly, he was having some sort of reaction to the shot. And so she forgot about the weirdness around why he got the shot and how he got the shot, and said to him, like, hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you. And at this, Richard kind of sat up straight and took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself down. And even though obviously his shoulders still hurt from the shot, he said to Janet that, the guy from the NHS told me this was normal. There's pain associated with this particular shot, and it would just go away on its own. And so I'm just gonna wait and let this thing fade. At this point, Janet was still worried about Richard, but, he seemed pretty confident that this was not a big deal. And so she decided she would simply follow his lead. And she said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And then she turned and she went upstairs and continued trying to do her bank statements. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Because over those 48 hours since Richard got that COVID shot, the spot on his arm, the injection site, had turned red and began to blister and bleed. And then eventually it turned black. And so at that point, they went to the ER. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh to stop the spread of this infection. But before they could even do that, they needed to figure out how this infection had even begun. And so at this point, Richard began telling the doctors all about how, 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and pretty much right away it had been so painful, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. And then also, over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs. She had seen him walking out the front door, she just saw the white lab coat, but something about him seemed weirdly familiar, but she kind of put that thought out of her mind. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. She realized she knew why this guy seemed so familiar. And this realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised, and so Janet and Richard did not recognize them. This man's name was Thomas Kwan. And Thomas, after coming inside their home, did not inject Richard with COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain that Richard was feeling that caused him to scream out, and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. It would turn out Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison.
37-year-old David Blair was a senior merchant seaman working for the British shipping company called White Star Line. In February of that year, he was informed by his company that he would be the second officer of this massive luxury cruise liner that was still being built in Northern Ireland. As the second officer, David's primary responsibility was the ship's navigational operations, amongst other things. Now, David had handled these responsibilities on other ships, but he'd never done it on a ship of this size. This would easily be the most challenging thing David had done in his career to date. But he told his family he was really excited about it. David immediately moved to Belfast, where the ship was being built, and he lived there for 3 months until construction was done. On April 2nd, the final rivet was put into the ship, and it was launched successfully into the water. And then after that, David and the rest of the crew and staff got on board and they set sail. Their first stop was Southampton in the UK, and for this leg of the journey, it was just going to be the crew and the staff. 2 days later, they arrived without incident, and for the next several days, the ship remained in port as the crew prepped it for its first true maiden voyage, which was going to be to New York City. On April 10th, all preparations had been made, and finally it was time to allow the paying customers to come on board. And in just a couple of hours, thousands of people were on board this huge ship. And just hours before they were set to depart, David was given some bad news. His bosses at White Star Line had decided that this journey was too high profile, and while David certainly had experience, he didn't have a lot of experience with huge ships. And so he was being replaced with someone who did. Understandably, he was crushed, but more than this being a disappointment, this 11th hour change was a huge hassle. With literally thousands of passengers getting in the way all over the ship, David needed to scramble and run all over the place and collect all of his things in the cabin, up on the bridge, and various closets he had put things. He had to do that as fast as he could before the ship took off. And so finally, after doing that with his last armful of luggage in hand, he said goodbye to the crew and to the staff. He said best of luck to his replacement, and he walked off the ship for good. David, with all of his luggage, made his way to a hotel where immediately that night he wrote a letter to his family saying how disappointed he was, and then after that he went to bed. The next morning, when he was going through all of his luggage, he discovered that he had taken a key by accident from the ship. And this key was to a special closet that he was in charge of as the second officer that contained all of the ship's binoculars. And so he felt terrible, but there was nothing he could do. The ship had already left and was on its way to New York. And so the best he could do was he would mail the key back to them in New York when they got there. Back on board the ship, when they discovered this key was missing, they did figure out that David must have it because he was the only one who would have had the key, and it's a brand new ship, so nobody else would have had it. But they decided that it wasn't worth turning around to go get this key. They figured their lookouts were skilled enough they could spot any obstructions with their naked eye. Well, 5 days later, that ship, the Titanic, struck an iceberg and sunk, killing 1,500 people. One of the very few survivors was a guy named Fred Fleet. 2013, 69-year-old retired middle school teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old Joe Blakesley, who was a physician, headed off to the Craters on the Moon Park in Idaho. This park is actually a dormant volcano. It's not extinct. It's going to be active again, probably in the next 1,000 years. But for now, it's this beautiful park that is known for these crazy lava fields that look otherworldly. You know, barely any vegetation can grow on them, and there's just a strip of pavement they've kind of weaved through these massive jagged lava fields. And then you have all these big mounds that are the actual volcanoes. Another feature of this park are all the lava tubes underground. All the molten lava, when it jets around underneath the surface before shooting out, it carves these natural tunnels underground, these huge caverns. They're like these big caves you can explore. And there's 1,100 miles of lava tubes, tunnels, and caves underneath this park. The two women told their families they would be back in Boise, Idaho by the 21st. But when the 21st came and they were not home, their families were suspicious. They tried calling them, they didn't pick up. And for the next 36 hours, they just kept trying to call them and, called around to see if anybody else knew where they were. And then finally, on the morning of the 23rd, when no one knew where they were, they reached out to the authorities. The formal search for these two women began on the 24th, so 5 days after they had initially left for this trip. And the searchers quickly found their pickup truck parked in the parking lot of the Craters on the Moon Park. And in their truck were their two dogs, who were alive, they were okay, and in the front seat were their purses and their cell phones. But there was no sign of Amy or Joe. This was obviously a bad sign, and so the search was really kicked into high gear to see if they could find these women before it was too late. But unfortunately, within 24 hours of finding the truck, they would find Amy's body. And her body was located way off of the main trail. She was in an area that the park superintendent described as incredibly rugged and inaccessible. Now, at this park, there is a strip of cement that weaves through this really dangerous lava field. And if you were on this strip of cement, you wouldn't be thinking about walking onto the lava field. Not only would you need to navigate all these massive mounds of jagged, cooled lava, there's all these cracks in the ground that you could fall through and just plummet to your death. So no one's about to start walking off the trail, especially not two older women that went here just to have a casual stroll through the park. They were not there for some grand adventure. They were not athletic distance hikers. It made no sense that Amy would be so far off the trail in an area that was so dangerous and so clearly off limits. When the families were notified that Amy had been found and they were still looking for Joe, the detail that the family keyed in on was the idea that these two women left their dogs in the truck. That was something so unbelievably uncharacteristic of either of them. They adored those two dogs. They would never, ever abandon them like that. In fact, because of that detail, the families jumped to this has to be foul play because they never would have done that. They wouldn't have abandoned these precious dogs. The search for Joe would continue. They basically shifted the entire effort to center over Amy where she was found and work in circles out from there to see if they could find her. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had mining experts walking through all the lava tubes below, and they couldn't find her. Finally, on October 23rd, so 28 days after Amy was found, Joe's body was discovered as well, and she was lying 1 mile away from where Amy had been found in a similarly inaccessible part of the park that would have required significant climbing over jagged, cooled lava fields and all these cracks in the ground she would have had to navigate to reach where she was. And even more strangely is the area where she was found had been searched extensively by air with helicopter pilots flying overhead and by cadaver sniffing dogs that had been in that area and they had not picked up her scent. So either the helicopter pilots and the cadaver sniffing dogs were just wrong or missed something, or Joe had not been there the whole time. A cause of death has not been determined for either of the two women. However, what was released is neither of them appeared to have suffered an incapacitating injury, meaning they weren't struck down where they were. They were traveling and ultimately stopped where they were. It seems highly unlikely that these two women abandoned their two dogs and left their cell phones in the car and then wandered way off the trail and separated from each other, all without supplies. But even if they had done that, even if they had, separated and left the trail, where they ultimately reached seems like an area they would not have been able to get to without assistance. And since they were separated, they weren't able to help each other get where they were. So although authorities have ruled out foul play, this was deemed an accident, it does seem like if there was ever a place to commit an attack, it would be this particular park, because underneath the park is 1,100 miles of lava tubes that connect to each other and weave all through the park. And there's hundreds of caves, many of which have not been found or explored, that it would be pretty straightforward to attack someone and then go underground and not be found. Certainly makes you wonder who or what could be hiding underground in those lava tubes. The Japanese famously attacked Pearl Harbor, the US military base in Hawaii. But Pearl Harbor was not the only US base attacked by the Japanese that month. In fact, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese shifted gears and attacked US military personnel on Wake Island, which is a coral atoll in the northern Pacific Ocean. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese had taken Wake Island from the Americans, and they sent the majority of American military personnel and American civilian contractors to prisoner of war camps in Asia. But they retained 98 of these POWs to stay on the island and fortify defenses. Over the next couple of years, the Americans would periodically bomb Wake Island, but there was never any concerted effort to take it back from the Japanese. However, that all changed on October 5th, 1943, when the Americans decided it was time to take it back. They launched a huge air raid on the island that was so violent, the Japanese admiral on Wake Island was convinced a full-scale invasion was imminent. And so in his paranoia, he ordered the 98 POWs they had retained on the island to be executed. And so they marched these 98 POWs to the edge of the sea, they blindfolded them, and then they gunned them down. But in the chaos of the air raid and the execution, one of the American POWs somehow managed to escape. After the Japanese had left the area, this POW snuck back down to the execution site, and he carved into the rock a memorial for all 98 of the POWs. So he was including himself in that number because I'm sure he knew he would eventually be recaptured. This was a small area and he was the only American there. And sure enough, this POW was recaptured that day and he was personally executed by the Japanese admiral. The identity of this POW has never been determined. After the war ended, the Japanese admiral that ordered these executions was tried for war crimes, found guilty, and put to death himself. The so-called 98 Rock can still be seen on Wake Island today. In 2003, 41-year-old veteran construction worker Ron Hunt was part of a crew that was building a house in Reno, Nevada. On that particular day, Ron knew before he could do anything else on the job site, the first thing he needed to do was drill a couple of large holes in the ceiling of one of the rooms in this house. And so as soon as he got to the job site that morning, he went in the back of his truck and pulled out a 6-foot-tall stepladder and a drill, and then walked into that particular room. Once inside, he opened up a stepladder and placed it where he wanted it, and then he tested his drill by squeezing the trigger a couple of times. And so once he knew that worked, he climbed up the ladder a couple of steps, not to the very top, but just a couple of steps, and began punching holes in the ceiling with this drill. Now, at first, these holes were very easy to punch through, but when he got down and moved the ladder to another section of this room where he also needed holes in the ceiling, when he got up there, he could not get the drill to go through the ceiling. And he didn't really get it because he knew there was nothing behind the ceiling that would stop the drill from going through, and it was just wood, so it really should be going through. And so he decided he just needed a little bit of extra leverage. He needed to really press on the back of this drill while he's pulling the trigger. And so instead of standing on the second or third rung of the 6-foot-tall stepladder, he walked to the very top of the ladder, the kind of dangerous section you're not supposed to stand on any ladder. And from there, he was in a better position to really push this drill into the ceiling. And so he gets in position and kind of feels like the ladder's fairly stable. And then he lines up this drill where he wants it. He begins squeezing the trigger. And at the same time, he really pushes with all that extra leverage into the ceiling. And as he does that, he feels the drill starting to go into the wood. But at the same time, he's pushing so hard that he's not realizing he's pushing down with his feet at a bit of an angle. And at some point, he pushes too hard and he causes the ladder to spill out from underneath him. Ron instinctively tried to throw the drill away from him, which is a common practice amongst construction workers. You don't want to land on your gear, it could hurt you. But he wasn't able to throw the drill far enough away from him. And even worse, the drill, when it hit the ground, basically right underneath him, it landed on its back with the drill bit pointing straight up into the air. And so when he fell down face first, his right eye socket landed directly on the drill. And so this 18-inch long, 1.5-inch in diameter drill bit impales his head, goes right through his eyeball, goes through his skull, and punctures out the back of his head. And so Ron, he hits the ground, but he's conscious. And so without even rolling over, he just reaches up with his hands and he feels the base of this drill, and then he traces to the drill bit and he feels it going into his eye, and then he feels around the back of his head and he feels the rest of the drill coming out of his skull. And at that point, he just starts screaming. The only other worker on the job site at the time was this man named Forrest, and Forrest, who was in a separate part of the job site, he hears Ron screaming, and so he runs over, he goes in the room, and he sees Ron, who's now standing up, cradling the drill base. The bit, the 18-inch bit, is still poking through his head, and so Ron is looking at Forrest and then turns to the side to show him that he's been fully impaled by this thing, and Forrest is totally horrified at what he's seeing. He can't believe Ron is even alive, but then Forrest jumps into action. He rips his shirt off, runs over to Ron, and kind of wraps it around his head to try to control the bleeding a little bit, and then he tells Ron to stay where he is, and then Forrest ran out of the job site, ran about 1,000 feet away to the nearest house, and he was able to use their phone to call paramedics. The paramedics arrive in an ambulance a few minutes later, and they find Ron sitting next to Forrest, just with this drill still in his face. Ron is very obviously in shock because he's not making any sound. He's totally conscious, but he's just kind of staring blankly, holding on to this thing. And so the paramedics, they go over and they detach the drill base from the drill bit. So all that's left is the actual 18-inch rod that's been pushed through his head. And then they take Ron via ambulance to a local hospital. And from there, they actually fly him in a helicopter to a bigger hospital that can handle this kind of injury. And so when he arrives at this larger hospital, they rush him immediately to the operating room. And at first, the surgeons attempted to cut off either end of this bit, the part that's sticking out the front of his eye and the part that's sticking out the back of his head. But they realized once they did that, there would still be this huge piece of bit that was stuck in his skull, and that would obviously be a huge problem. And so after thinking about it, they decided their best bet was just to unscrew the bit from his head. And so they gave him some morphine, and then over the next couple of hours, the doctors slowly twisted this piece of metal until it finally unwound itself out of his skull. And apparently, as they were doing that, Ron, who was so high on painkillers, was cracking jokes about how somebody needs to come in here and take a picture of me. I probably look so great. And so miraculously, Ron would survive, and he would not even be paralyzed. The worst thing that happened to him is he lost the sight in his right eye. But all things considered, Ron is okay with that. The surgeons would tell Ron that the only reason he didn't die or get paralyzed is because when that drill bit went into his skull, it kind of pressed his brain aside as it passed through. Had it punctured his brain when it went through, that almost certainly would have killed him, but by some unbelievably slim chance, it did not, and he survived. Here is Ron's X-ray. Before we dine, 15-year-old Christina Grimmie finally caved and made her own YouTube channel. For years, her friends and family had been begging her to do this because Christina had this incredible singing voice that they wanted the world to hear, but Christina had always been hesitant because she was a bit of an introvert. But that year, Christina was feeling more outgoing, and so she took the plunge, she makes this channel, and in July of that year, she uploads her first 2 songs. They were both cover songs, and she was really proud of them, but when she uploaded them, they didn't get very many views. And so Christina probably was not very excited about making more videos. But a month later, she found herself really enjoying the song Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus. And so she was singing it all the time and humming it all the time. And so finally she said, okay, I'll just film myself covering that song. And so she records herself singing this song. She uploads it to her YouTube channel, her 3rd video, and she thinks no one's going to see it because her first 2 videos no one really saw. But this video is different. It went viral almost immediately, and millions of people saw it, and they loved it. Christina couldn't believe it, even though her friends and family had been telling her all along, you have this great voice, you got to share it with the world. That's different than actually seeing the results of the world saying, you're really great, we love your voice. And so she saw this huge opportunity, and she began uploading more and more music to her channel, and more of her videos went viral. Over the next 4 4 years, she amassed over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel. She put out her own album, and she even went on tour with the mega celebrity pop star Selena Gomez. In 2014, Christina auditioned for the TV singing competition called The Voice. This show only allows a very small number of contestants who are all incredibly talented musicians. They get screened really aggressively before the competition even starts. But despite the very intense competition she was up against, Christina still managed to finish 3rd overall in this competition. Now, she might have been a little bit let down that she didn't finish 1st, but that show did wonders for her career because the judges of this competition were mega celebrity musicians, and every time Christina was on TV doing her performance for the competition, the judges would be raving about how talented she was and that even if she doesn't win this competition, someone's going to sign her. She's so incredible. And then sure enough, shortly after that competition ended, Christina was signed to a major record label. But despite being considered a star by the masses, Christina still very much viewed herself as being a YouTuber first, which meant despite her mainstream popularity and fame, she continued to upload songs and vlogs to her YouTube channel because she wanted to stay connected to her fans. YouTubers often upload videos that appear very amateur, like not professionally produced. It almost looks like anybody could have picked up their phone and filmed that video. And YouTubers tend to be very candid and show their personality in their videos. And so it makes YouTubers, especially these really popular ones, seem very real and raw and relatable. Unlike traditional celebrities that are kind of outside of society, living in their mansions, living a totally elite and different lifestyle. YouTubers feel like they're your friends. And this was definitely the case with Christina. On her videos, she came off as very humble and gracious and kind and friendly, and so her fans truly adored her. By June of 2016, Christina was still growing in popularity when she was asked to be the opening act for this concert in Orlando, Florida that was happening later that month. She agreed, and then on the day of the concert, which was June 10th, she posted to her social media this kind of shout out to all of her fans saying, hey, if you're in the Orlando, Florida area, come out to my show. And then after the show, I'm going to stick around and sign autographs and meet you guys. That night, the venue where this concert was happening was jam-packed, and most of the people were there for Christina, not the main act. And so Christina, she goes on stage, she has this incredible performance, the main act goes on stage, and then around 10 p.m., the concert ends, at which point Christina comes back out from behind stage and went right out into the crowd and began meeting her fans and hugging them and signing autographs and taking pictures. And then at 10:24 p.m., a man who was a fan of Christina's walked down from the back of the venue and kind of awkwardly gestured that he kind of wanted to get a hug. And Christina saw that, and so she smiled and she walked up to him. She opened her arms to give him a big hug. And when she got just a couple of feet away from him, he drew a pistol and he fired 4 shots into her head and into her body. Christina's brother, Mark, he was standing right nearby and he saw the attack. And so he tackled the shooter and he was trying to get control of this guy. But at some point, the shooter managed to wriggle free, and then he stood up and he kind of walked backwards until he was literally up against this wall looking at the sea of people that are totally horrified. People are screaming and running and no one knows what he's going to do next. And then the shooter just raises the gun, puts it to his head, and pulls the trigger. There were people in the audience who were medically trained who rushed over to Christina and they began performing CPR on her, but there really wasn't anything anyone could do. She would die that night at the hospital. Her killer was a 27-year-old man named Kevin Loibel. He, like many people, had become a Christina superfan, but his infatuation with her became a totally unhealthy obsession. And when it eventually dawned on him that he most likely would never have a romantic relationship with Christina, he came to the conclusion that if I can't have her, no one can have her. And so when Christina put that post out on social media asking people to come to Orlando to see her show and meet her after the show, he took that as an opportunity to go kill her. And so he lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is 120 miles away. And so he sees this post on social media. He grabs his 2 pistols, some extra ammunition. He gets a large hunting knife, and then he calls a cab. The cab drives him 120 miles northeast to Orlando, Florida. And then he gets into the venue with his weaponry because there weren't metal detectors and no one was frisking people as they came inside. And so he was in the back of the venue venue during the show. And then when it was over, he kind of lingered back, allowing other fans to go up and, kind of mob Christina. And then when there was a lull and there were less people down there with her, he strode right down the aisle and he ended her life. Here is a photo of Kevin standing in the back of this venue just moments before the show came to an end. 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law. And so in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish and become quite good at it rather quickly. During her college Spanish studies, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela very quickly recognized in Samantha that she had this incredible intellect and work ethic and just knew she was destined for greatness. In fact, she compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous international lawyers ever. And so just out of a general interest to see Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on something, or if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of her, she would be available. And Samantha had taken her up on this offer, and by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a sort of mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha got accepted into her target law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so after telling her mother and father, Samantha ran to Daniela's office to tell her mentor the great news. And the two hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was clear that everything was falling into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just very, very proud of her. A few weeks later, on March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Now, Samantha normally spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends, but since she was about a month away from graduation and she was already accepted to law school and really didn't have that much work since it was the end of the year anyways, she decided she could cut loose for that weekend. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called 5 Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina, and it's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, so on the weekends it is packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hop from bar to bar, they're having a great time, and then around 2 a.m. the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and while they were there, because it was so crowded, the group of friends got separated. Now, initially, the friends were trying to reconnect with each other through texts and phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other. And kind of in the middle of all that, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer. And so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So Samantha leaves the Bird Dog bar on her own. She hops in an Uber and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up that following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room. And so they called her, she didn't pick up. They started asking around to other friends who might know where she was, but no one did. And so pretty quickly, Samantha's friends were very, very worried about her because the last they had seen her, she was leaving the bar on her own. And so they were really worried something might have happened to her. And so by 1:30 p.m. that day, on that Saturday, the day after they had gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these two men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds, and so they were getting frustrated. And so by the afternoon, they had split up and were kind of combing this forest on their own to see if they would have more luck solo. And so Ryan, he posted up next to their truck, which was parked on this dirt road that was butted up against the edge of this big forest. And Ryan, with his binoculars, was scanning out across this field that butted up against the tree line of the forest, and he was kind of scanning the tree line, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he actually had walked into that forest, which was right next to Ryan, and he was just kind of walking around looking for the birds as well, but he too was still having no luck. And so around 4:30 p.m., Anders, who's the one in the forest, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. And so he turns around and begins walking out of the forest in the direction of Ryan. And so at this point, point, he's maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees are very thick and they can't really see each other. And so Anders is just kind of walking in that direction. He's not looking for birds anymore, so he's not scouting around. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. And as he's walking, something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked, and he couldn't really tell what it was. It wasn't a turkey, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the forest. And so he decided he would go get a better look. And so he turned away from Ryan and went left and started cutting through the trees. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by trees. And when he got a full look at this thing that had caught his attention, he stopped where he was. He yelled for Ryan, who couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at this. And as Ryan is running into the forest to see what's going on, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally show up, they find Anders and Ryan, and they're very shaken up, and they're sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been. And so the police pull up to them, they speak to them and get directions of how to get to what they saw inside of the forest. And then the police officers walk into the forest, they follow the directions, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha left the Bird Dog Bar and walked out front where there's lots of other students, and she walked to this corner of this road right in front of her, and she hailed an Uber. And then the Uber car pulls up, she hops inside, and then the car backs up and drives away. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night, presumably to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his plan had worked. He had pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed in without question. And then once she was inside, she couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. There was no way to open them unless they were opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She just sat in the back seat. The car backed up. It started driving, except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove the opposite direction. And the drive from this bar to the campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so even if she wasn't really paying attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly they were going the wrong way because, again, she's expecting to get dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car in terms of how Samantha actually handled this realization that he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized it was child locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the back seat of his car where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting these normal posts on Facebook of him in front of his car and regular status updates, and he was having very normal interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely unaffected by this horrible crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. And so he just began prowling around for a victim, and unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Here are the final images of Samantha as she climbs into Nathaniel's car. College dropout and a former Army Green Beret, which is the Army's Special Forces. He and his wife Vicky were religious fundamentalists and deeply distrusted the government and believed the end of the world was imminent. In the early 1980s, they began hoarding guns and began making plans to live in some secluded area off the grid. In 1984, Randy, Vicky, and their children moved into a cabin they had built themselves overlooking Ruby Creek in Idaho. By choice, they had no electricity and no water. After receiving information that Randy had made threats against the the president, Ronald Reagan, and other government officials, the FBI and the Secret Service began investigating him. Although no charges were ever filed against him, in their investigation, they discovered he had ties to the Aryan Nation, which is a white supremacist group. So in 1989, when Randy inadvertently sold 2 illegal weapons to undercover ATF agents, they said, instead of arresting you and sending you to jail, you can actually become an informant on the Aryan Nation. But Randy said he wasn't tied to the Aryan Nation and couldn't do that, and so they indicted him for making and keeping illegal weapons. After being released on bail in 1991, Randy missed his court date, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. The U.S. Marshal Service was now responsible for bringing Randy in, but given his significant weapon arsenal and his anti-government stance, they assumed he would not go easily. And so they decided they would launch a secret surveillance campaign of Randy, his family, and where they lived to gain some intelligence on what they did day to day and find the right time to go up and apprehend him. So in early 1992, secret surveillance teams were set up all around the Weaver family cabin, and what they found was the Weaver family, despite being extremist, they mostly kept to themselves, and they definitely were not aware they were being watched. The only reason the marshals didn't just go up and apprehend him was because anytime the Weavers were outside of their cabin, they were always armed. A few months later, in August, as the surveillance teams were getting ready to set up for the day to gather more intelligence on the Weavers, the Weaver dogs took notice of the surveillance teams and started charging into the woods barking like maniacs. And Randy, along with his friend Kevin Harris that was staying with them, and Randy's teenage son Sammy, took off after the dogs, not knowing that they were going to be running straight into a government surveillance team. And when these two parties encountered each other, a firefight ensued that left Sammy, Randy's son, dead, along with their dog dead, and one of the marshals, William Deegan, was killed as well. Who shot first and who shot whom would later be hotly debated by all the survivors in the courts and in the media. Immediately after the shooting stopped, Randy and Kevin turned around and ran back up to the cabin to take cover. Meanwhile, the surviving marshals ran out of the forest and they told their boss what had happened, and their boss is like, this is going to turn into a standoff, we need this to end right now. And so he called the FBI and he painted a picture of the Weaver family and Randy specifically as this enormous threat, that it had been this unprovoked attack on the marshals and that they got to come in force to put an end to this thing. And so the next day, hundreds of FBI agents, huge vehicles and helicopters, they all showed up in this little area in Idaho getting ready to do battle with the Weaver family. Because the FBI had been told the Weaver family was this huge threat, they authorized all of their snipers to shoot any armed adult without warning them. Normally, the FBI, if they see someone who's armed, they would yell at them to stop what they were doing, put their weapon down, warn them. Unless, of course, this person is actively shooting at them, then of course the FBI is going to shoot back. But if it's just an armed person standing there, the FBI can't just engage them. But in this situation, the FBI said, this threat is so big, we're changing the rules. And so you had all these FBI snipers all around the Weaver property that are all amped up, they're getting ready to engage the enemy, they're off safe, finger on trigger, slack out, ready to engage the first adult they see. And so it stayed like this for quite a while, a total stalemate, until Randy, Kevin Harris, and Randy's teenage daughter Sarah decided to leave their cabin and go down to Sammy to pay their respects. But Randy and Kevin were carrying weapons, and so after they left the cabin, they walked a little ways away, and then snipers opened up on them. In that initial volley of fire, only Randy got hit in the shoulder, and so Randy, Kevin, and Sarah, they turn, they start running back towards the cabin to take cover, and standing in the doorway of the cabin, inside the cabin, is Vicky, Randy's wife, and she's standing there holding their 10-month-old daughter, and so Randy makes it inside, Sarah makes it in the front door, Kevin is the last one to go through the door, and right as he's going through the doorway, the sniper had his sights set on Kevin, and he fired, he missed Kevin, the round went through the door, and it hit Vicky squarely in the head, and it killed her instantly. Adding insult to injury, the FBI did not know they had just killed their mother, and so after the shooting stopped, and the door had shut, and the Weavers are back inside the cabin, the FBI began calling out to them, saying, Mrs. Weaver, come out, don't you want to protect your kids? Come out, and we'll get you guys pancakes, and you can sit with your kids, you gotta get them out of there. But Vicky was dead, they just didn't know. Ultimately, the FBI went out and got a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran who had similar views to Randy, and they sent him in to try to convince Randy to stop this and surrender, and eventually he got Randy to do that, so no more blood was shed. Later, an investigation would show law enforcement that was handling this case made a number of really critical mistakes early on, the first big mistake being the miscommunication between the marshals to the FBI about how big of a threat the Weaver family really posed. Now, they certainly were a threat, but they were not such a big threat that they required hundreds of FBI agents and helicopters and armored vehicles. The second critical mistake was when the FBI authorized their snipers to shoot at armed adults without a warning. That's almost certainly why Vicky was killed. In the end, despite having a plethora of charges against him, jurors decided that Randy Weaver was only guilty of not showing up to that court date. Amid intense federal scrutiny of the Ruby Ridge scandal, the FBI's number 2 person was demoted, 3 other agents were suspended, and 1 was sent to jail for trying to cover up the mistakes the FBI had made during this case. As for the Weaver family, they were given a $3.1 million settlement by the government, and Kevin Harris had all charges dropped against him, and he won a 6-figure settlement. Of all the pictures that came out of Ruby Ridge, there's none more famous than this one taken by one of the surveillance teams of Vicky just before she was shot by that sniper. Year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory. And so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over, she was so tired. And so while Deanna's in this state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last 2 pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. Forever when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. These bombs would devastate the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 100,000 people. America's goals in dropping these 2 bombs was to hasten Japan's surrender and end World War II, as well as avoid any further Allied casualties. But America also wanted to showcase to the world, really the Soviet Union, that it had this new, extremely destructive technology at their disposal. So on August 6, 1945 at 8:15 a.m., the crew of the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first ever wartime atomic bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. At the time, Hiroshima was a bustling regional hub that served as a military communications center, storage depot, and troop gathering area. When the bomb detonated over Hiroshima, immediately there was this flash of boiling light that scorched everything it touched. The blast burned at 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 70,000 people that were within 1,600 feet of the initial blast radius were instantly incinerated. After the dust had settled, 5 square miles of the city were just rubble. The Sumitomo Bank was within that blast radius. That morning before the bomb detonated, an elderly resident of Hiroshima had been sitting on the front steps of the bank waiting for the doors to open. They were clutching their walking stick and they had their other arm against their chest right as the bomb exploded. And when it did, they were one of the 70,000 people that were instantaneously vaporized. This Hiroshima shadow, as it's called, is all that is left of this person. Their shadow remained on the front steps of this bank for over 20 years before they finally removed that section of the stairs and brought it to a museum. Zach Bowen, when they were both bartending in New Orleans. Addie liked to give Zach a really hard time and kind of played the mean girl as her way of flirting with him, but really what she was doing is testing Zach to see if he could put up with her, because she had a mean streak. She would have these crazy, angry outbursts and would yell and scream at people around her, and then she'd turn it off just like that, and she needed to make sure that he could put up with her. Zach, it would turn out, had his own mean streak and his own angry outbursts, and so in many ways they were very similar. Many of Zach and Addie's friends that were around them in those first few weeks they were together did not think this relationship would last very long because of how often they fought with each other. But it just so happened that Zach and Addie had met one another just weeks before Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans and just devastated the area. And so before it arrived, Zach and Addie decide, let's stick it out. Let's stay here together. Let's ride this storm out together. And it was actually that storm that brought them together, and they both fell madly in love with each other and became totally inseparable. After the storm cleared, Zach and Addie went out into the streets and began cooking food for people, and they had all this alcohol in their apartment, and they set up a makeshift bar outside in the French Quarter and were just giving away drinks to these people whose lives had been devastated by this storm. Their tale of love and colorful survivalism attracted many media outlets, including the New York Times, who did a feature on them. For a time, Zach and Addie felt like the king and queen of the French Quarter, and they were so happy. But when reality set back in and the real cleanup ensued and electricity was restored and people started moving back into their homes and people started going to work again, Zach and Addie were forced back into their old lifestyle, something neither of them wanted to experience again. So for the next year, Zach and Addie struggled to make ends meet, their bills continued to pile up, and really those two were at each other's throats all the time with these horrible, vicious fights. In October of 2006, when it seems like Zach and Addie's relationship is really on the rocks, they decide in order to reinvigorate their relationship, they're going to move out of their current apartment where there's lots of bad memories, and they're going to move into a new one. They found a little apartment over the famed Voodoo Temple on Rampart Street, and they immediately made a cash offer and they moved in. No sooner had they moved in did Addie go down to the landlord and say, remove Zach from the lease. She had found out that he was cheating on her, and she was preparing to kick him out of her life. Zach found out that he was not on the lease before Addie could confront him about it, and it turned into this wicked fight between the two of them. A couple of days later, Zach showed up for work at the bar, and some of his coworkers recalled that he was acting really funny. He was wearing a hat pulled down low over his head and sunglasses and was really quiet. And when anybody asked him, like, what's going on with you? Why are you acting so strange? He would just tell them he was fine and would quickly walk away from them. Around the same time, Addie stopped showing up for work at all, and her co-workers turned to Zach and said, "Where's Addie?" And he would say that they got into this fight and that Addie had actually left New Orleans and gone back to her hometown in North Carolina. And some people thought that was a little bit fishy because Addie loved New Orleans, but anybody that knew Addie knew she was very unpredictable, and if they had had this huge blowout fight, it is possible that she could have left for North Carolina. A week later, on October 17th, 2006, the New Orleans police receive a phone call from a hotel in the area that spotted what they think is a body laying on the roof of their parking garage. When the police arrived, they could tell it was a deceased man and that he had died from impact, but they couldn't tell if it was a murder, a suicide, or a tragic accident. So they began searching his body to see if there was any indication of what happened, and they pull out a note that's addressed to police in his back pocket. The note is fairly long, but he communicates to the police that this was not an accident. I had to take my own life because I took a life, and if you go to my apartment on Rampart Street, you'll find the body of my girlfriend, Addie Hall, who I killed. Police rush to the address that was given in the note. They're horrified at what they find inside. As soon as they stepped into the apartment, the temperature dropped. The air conditioning had been set to the lowest it could possibly be, so it's very cold in the apartment. And they look around and they see these strange messages spray painted all over the walls. Things like, "I'm a total failure," and "Look in the oven." And there are arrows pointing on the walls towards the kitchen and towards the oven itself that's sitting in the kitchen. And sure enough, when they open up the oven, they find Addie. Police also found Addie's journal, and inside of it, Zach had left an 8-page, very detailed confession of how he had strangled Addie and then had tried to cook her to make it easier to dispose of her body, but couldn't finish the job, and that's when he went to the hotel and threw himself off. Here are some crime scene photos from outside the apartment as well as inside. You can see some of the messages that Zach had spray painted to the wall indicating to go check the oven. And here is the infamous oven where Addie's remains were found, as well as a message left in the kitchen saying that he was sorry he couldn't finish, in reference to his inability to finish cooking her and disposing of her body. Crazy as it sounds, this apartment is still being rented out today, and it includes this exact, as above all else, a huge bear enthusiast. His passion for these creatures led to a passion for environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking, the subject of which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. And so starting in the late 1980s, Treadwell began going to Katmai National Park and setting up a camp there for the whole summer and filming all of his interactions with the grizzly bears. During the first half of the summer, Treadwell would stay in an area that he referred to as the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was this area near Hallow Bay. It was this big open green field, and all the grizzly bears seemed to just converge on this one area and kind of mosey around and be lazy. They were not aggressive at all towards Treadwell, and so he could walk up fairly close to them and just shoot great footage of these huge animals. During the second half of the summer, he would leave the Grizzly Sanctuary and go south to an area called Kaflia Bay. And it was a much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. Treadwell could use vegetation to get right up close to some of these bears without them necessarily seeing him. He referred to this area as the Grizzly Maze. Treadwell developed a fairly bad reputation amongst the park rangers of Katmai National Park because he was pretty reckless about how he interacted with these animals. I mean, they are big, wild predators, and he would get right up close and in their personal space, and every time he was just rolling the dice because eventually they thought something bad was going to happen to him. Treadwell believed he was taking every precaution and that what he was doing was safe, but Treadwell had become very emotionally connected to the grizzly bears he was seeing at Katmai National Park. He felt so comfortable with them that he would actually walk up sometimes and pet and goof around with the bear cubs. And for whatever reason, the grizzly bear parents would not harm him. And so he felt like he was kind of one of them, and they respected him and they welcomed him into their environment. Normally, whenever Treadwell went to Alaska for the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera. But at the end of the summer, in October 2003, when normally Timothy would leave Alaska because October is the time when the grizzlies become more aggressive because they're trying to eat as much food as they can before going into hibernation, Timothy decides that instead of leaving, he's going to extend his stay one more week, and he's going to fly his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, into Alaska to spend that week with him. Friends and family did not think this was a good idea, but Timothy was like, nope, it's going to be just fine. I know these animals better than anybody else. They are not going to hurt us. So he flies Amy in and they set up camp along a grizzly trail inside of the grizzly maze. Neither of them were carrying a weapon or bear repellent spray. A week later, when the pilot returned to pick up Timothy and Amy, he looked up the hill and he could clearly see their campsite was not broken down. They had not packed it up yet. They were not down at the shoreline. So he gets out of his plane and he starts walking up the hill towards their campsite, thinking maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they don't know they're getting picked up today. And as he crests the hill, he sees there is a huge grizzly bear pacing around as if guarding its prey in the middle of this campsite. The grizzly sees the pilot and makes a move as if he's going to run towards him. The pilot turns, runs back to his plane, and flies out of there. And he calls park rangers and alerts them to this grizzly bear that's in the middle of Timothy and Amy's campsite. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Timothy and Amy were deceased. Their remains were scattered all around this campsite. It was clear that a grizzly bear or more than one grizzly bear had absolutely ripped them to pieces. However, this wasn't even the most horrifying part of this discovery. As the bodies were being taken away, the park rangers began bundling up their stuff to take with them, and they found inside the tent a camera that had a 6-minute tape on it. At first, when they hit play, they thought it was a blank tape, but it wasn't. It was just inside the tent when it was recording, and so it had no visual, but then they started hearing audio. And for 6 agonizing minutes with a blank screen, they heard crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio suggests that Treadwell had left their tent because they heard a bear outside and was attacked. And he starts screaming for Amy to come outside. The bear has Timothy's head in its jaws, and Timothy is screaming, "It's killing me, it's killing me." And Amy is screaming back, "Play dead." And at some point, it's clear that's not working. They have no way to fight the animal. And Timothy starts yelling for Amy to run away. She's paralyzed with fear. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. And then Timothy is groaning and screaming. And eventually it stops when he drags Timothy away. And then Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of frozen in terror. And you hear the bear come back. And then her screams pick up. And then the tape goes quiet. This is the last picture of Timothy and Amy taken alive. It was taken right after Amy had landed in Alaska, and they were going to make their way up to the grizzly maze and camp out there for a few days in hopes of running into a grizzly bear. 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Allen was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Allen would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Allen would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Allen's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Allen, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Allen acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Allen steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Allen to come home and saying, "Don't do that again," he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Allen gets charged with theft. He pleads guilty and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record. So he kind of goes easy on him. And he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother and you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family, he was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead. Because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are. He goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house. It was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess, and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, "Don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail." And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave. This is the picture that Alan uploaded to his Instagram account just hours after killing his entire family. They're all lying on the ground in his house at the time this picture is being taken. He's in this fancy hotel room with his friends, and the caption reads, "College wouldn't be half as fun without these two peaches. Hashtag best unfold" at 8:49 a.m. on April 16th, 2014. The Seawall ferry that was on a routine trip to Jeju Island in South Korea was beginning to lean very badly to one side. The ferry had recently undergone illegal renovations, adding a whole bunch of new rooms to the top of the ferry that made it much more profitable, but dangerously top-heavy. Corrupt regulators who were bought off with fancy dinners and travel allowed the ship to sail unsafe despite never having stepped foot on board. Had they gone on the ship themselves, they would have seen immediately how unsafe it was. On April 16th, the day this ferry is making its way to Jeju Island and is now leaning to one side, ferry workers had loaded twice the legal limit onto the ferry and then hadn't properly secured really any of it. So there were cars and shipping containers that were not tethered. So as the badly balanced Seawall ferry is making its way out to Jeju Island, it hits some very strong currents and makes a sharp turn to avoid them, causing the ship to begin to keel over. As soon as it begins to keel over, all those unsecured cars and containers all shift all at once to one side of the ship, causing it to completely roll over on its side and begin sinking. On board were 476 passengers, of which 325 were high school students on a school trip. As soon as the ship comes to rest on its side, the captain comes over the intercom and tells everybody to stay in your rooms and await further instruction. And everybody listens. They all stay in their room. And honestly, you can't blame them, because they're on a routine ferry trip that happens dozens of times a day without any incident. And the captain of the ship is telling you everything's fine. You just stay where you are. We'll tell you what to do next. After a little while, a lot of the students start to feel a little bit anxious because there's been no further instruction. They're still sideways, and they're starting to realize that if they needed to, it would be hard to get out of the ship. A lot of them were way into the bowels of the ship, and they would literally need to climb up and out of the ship to safety. A student actually called the authorities and said, "Hey, I think the ship I'm on is sinking." And the authorities hadn't heard of it because the captain and the crew of the ship were just totally crippled and could not make a decision, and had wasted all this time that they could have been evacuating people and getting help, and instead were just panicked and frozen in terror. There would be over 20 calls from students pleading with authorities to come save them, because now they know the ship is sinking, because they can hear the sound of water rushing into the ship, and it's just a matter of time before it reaches them. Finally, almost an hour after the ship had originally keeled over onto its side, the captain issues the evacuation call to the whole ship. But at this point, water's already getting into the compartments where these students have been told to stay, and students aren't able to leave, and there's this panic to get out of the ship. So the evacuation order was doing nothing. It was already too late. One person who survived, who had left early and disobeyed the stay in your room order, they had climbed to the top of the ship, which was really the side of the ship, and they were looking down into the ship through a hallway. And they said there was this mass of people that were coming out of their rooms and trying to climb up this hallway right as a rush of water poured in through the side of this hallway and completely filled it, and they were gone. Later on, when divers would go down to recover the bodies, they would find that many of the students had broken fingers from desperately trying to climb up those hallways when water was pouring in on them. After the divers recovered the bodies, investigators began going through their cell phones to get some sense of what happened. And on their phones were these tragic pictures and videos of these students staying in their rooms like they were told to do, just waiting for their captain to give them further instruction that never came. The captain actually abandoned ship right after that 9:30 call to evacuate came, when hundreds of students were still down below. He left the ship. So they were totally on their own, just waiting for help that never came. Of the 476 passengers, 304 would perish, and many believe that almost all of them could have been saved had they just evacuated as soon as the ship keeled over. And so as a result of his gross negligence, the captain was given a life sentence.